So imagine you are walking down like a cold stone corridor.
Yeah, okay.
You're in an ancient, just completely isolated castle,
Mm.
and there's no electricity anywhere.
Right, no hum from an air conditioner or anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nothing. There's just the flickering light of this single torch you're holding, and it's casting these long, kind of dancing shadows against the damp, jagged walls.
Wow, okay.
Very atmospheric.
Yeah, and it is freezing in there. You are utterly alone. Now, the question is, what does that actually sound like?
Well, I mean, it definitely doesn't sound like silence. It sounds heavy. It sets a very specific
Almost.
cinematic expectation in your mind, doesn't it?
It really does. And that exact feeling, that precise atmosphere of cold, isolated fantasy, that is the center of our deep dive today. We are looking into this bizarre, rapidly growing, and just fiercely DIY music subculture, and it's called Dungeon Synth.
Which is honestly, genuinely one of the most perfectly descriptive genre names out there. Right. It tells you exactly what you're getting into. Now, what makes Dungeon Synth so compelling, I think, is that it sits at this unbelievable cultural crossroads.
Oh, totally.
Because it combines the extreme terrifying atmosphere of Norwegian black metal.
Yeah.
Right? But then mixes it with the nerdy, hyper-immersive storytelling of tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, and then you throw in the cheap, lo-fi digital sounds of, like, 1990s video games.
Which is just a wild mix.
It sounds like a complete paradox when you list those ingredients out loud. But, there's a real reason we're diving into this today.
Right.
Because even if listening to this right now, even if you've never rolled a 20-sided die or listened to a single second of extreme metal in your life, the psychology behind this genre is entirely relevant to you.
Oh, completely.
We are essentially looking at a masterclass in how self-imposed limitations and just a total rejection of modern perfection can actually build these incredibly rich inner worlds, especially today.
Yeah, in an era where we are constantly bombarded by, high-definition, limitless digital media all the time.
Exactly.
So let's start with what Dungeon Synth actually is, fundamentally. The best way the sources describe it is as a soundtrack without a movie.
Right. Or, maybe more accurately, environmental music for tabletop RPGs.
Yeah, it is the literal sound of a cheap synthesizer echoing in an isolated castle.
And even though it is purely audio, the genre is relentlessly visual. I mean, the music is completely obsessed with medieval and fantasy themes.
Absolutely.
The whole culture surrounding it is entirely focused on snow-covered forests, ancient masonry, dark magic. And that visual obsession kind of dictates exactly how the physical music is packaged and presented.
Yeah, the packaging is a massive part of the illusion. Artists in this space, they often use these vertical layouts for their album art.
Like a cassette tape.
Yes, specifically designed to mimic the dimensions of an old cassette tape insert. And they use these deliberately dirty, almost illegible Gothic fonts.
Oh yeah, you can barely read the band names half the time.
Right, plus old hand-drawn fantasy maps, retro pixel art, the works.
It's a whole aesthetic.
It is. But I have to admit, looking at all this, my initial reaction was, well, this is absurdly niche.
Oh, sure.
Like, it sounds like someone is taking the menu screen music of a 1995 MS-DOS computer game and treating it as highbrow, serious art. At first glance, it feels like pure, almost weaponized nostalgia.
I mean, that is definitely the hurdle most people have to get over when they first hear it, but it goes way deeper than just remembering the 90s fondly,
How so?
Well, the goal of Dungeon Synth isn't to showcase musical virtuosity. Nobody's trying to prove how fast their fingers can fly across a keyboard.
Right, there's no crazy solo.
Exactly. The entire philosophy is about presenting a scene. It's ambient music, but with a really strict narrative purpose.
Okay, so it's spatial.
Very. The artist's only job is to transport the listener into a very specific, highly melancholic physical space in their own imagination.
Okay, wait. If the goal is to create this quiet, melancholic, indoor fantasy space, how on earth did this originate from European extreme metal?
I know, it's wild.
Because that is the glaring irony of Dungeon Synth. The founders of this delicate, synth-based genre were literally Norwegian black metal musicians from the early 1990s.
The scariest dudes in music.
Literally. We're talking about guys who built their entire reputations on playing the loudest, fastest, most aggressive music on the planet.
The contrast is super jarring. But in the early 1990s, during what we'd call the proto-era of the genre, You had a few highly influential figures making this dramatic shift.
Right. Like who?
Well, the most prominent is Mortius. He was actually a former member of the legendary black metal band Emperor.
Oh, wow. Emperor is huge in that scene.
Right, and he leaves that incredibly chaotic, guitar-heavy sound totally behind. He just picks up a synthesizer and literally coins the phrase dark dungeon music for his solo project.
And Brazum was doing something similar around the same time, right?
Yeah, with those early ambient keyboard tracks on albums like HVIZ, Lycet Taros, and Philosophim.
Right. And at the time, nobody was using the term dungeon synth.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But modern artists look back at those specific 90s keyboard tracks as the absolute genesis of the movement.
So the obvious question here is, why the pivot? Why would musicians who are deeply entrenched in blast beats, distorted guitars, screaming vocals, why suddenly sit down and play slow, minimalist keyboard melodies?
It seems like a huge musical contradiction, but if you look at the psychology of the people involved, it's actually a direct logical continuation.
Really? How does that work?
Well, think about what Norwegian black metal actually represented at its core. Underneath all the noise, the themes were harsh Nordic climates, deep romanticism, profound isolation.
In a real biting misanthropy.
Exactly. They were making antisocial music.
So if you're in a traditional metal band, you have to compromise. You have to deal with a drummer's tempo, a bassist's schedule. You have to collaborate.
Right, and if you are truly antisocial, a band is basically a nightmare.
That makes total sense.
But a synthesizer. With a synthesizer, you are an absolute dictator. You don't need a drummer. You don't need anyone else in the room.
It's the ultimate tool for isolated control.
Precisely. These musicians realized they didn't need extreme volume to create a dark, oppressive atmosphere. They could achieve the exact same emotional weight and even greater isolation with a single long synthesizer chord played in an empty room.
They just distill the emotion right out of the chaos.
Yeah.
And that realization sparked the first wave of the genre, running from roughly 1995 to 2000.
Yeah, suddenly you had projects like Cernona's Woods and Depressive Silence popping up everywhere.
But they weren't getting traditional record deals. They were recording these atmospheric tracks onto cheap cassette tapes in their bedrooms and literally mailing them to each other across Europe.
The mail-order tape trading network was everything back then. It meant the genre was born entirely outside the commercial music industry.
Pure DIY.
Totally. That physical, hands-on exchange of cassettes cemented a fiercely DIY anti-corporate ethos that still defines the culture today.
But building that solitary anti-commercial world meant they couldn't just rent out a high-end studio in Oslo. They had to rely on gear that sounded as isolated as they felt.
Which brings us to the actual sound design. The recipe for building a dungeon, basically.
Yes. This is where the genre becomes truly fascinating to me because it elevates technical constraints into a rigid aesthetic.
Oh, absolutely. If a modern dungeon synth artist won the lottery tomorrow, they would not go hire $1 million symphony orchestra to play their music.
Doing that would instantly ruin the illusion.
Because realism breaks the spell.
Right.
If you hear a perfect, high-fidelity recording of a real cello, your brain pictures a bright, modern concert hall.
But if you hear a cheap, compressed 16-bit imitation of a cello?
Your brain pictures a forgotten, rotting ruin. They actively rely on what we would traditionally call bad equipment.
And the hardware choices are incredibly specific. They seek out cheap 90s PCM keyboards. Things like the Yamaha PSR.
Which was basically a plastic home keyboard you'd buy at a department store.
Exactly. Or the Roland JV series and the Korg M1.
And we should probably explain what PCM actually means because it dictates the entire sound.
Oh, definitely.
PCM stands for pulse code modulation. Back in the early 90s, digital memory in keyboards was incredibly expensive.
Right. So to get a choir sound, the keyboard manufacturers couldn't just record a lush 10-second sample of a real choir.
They literally didn't have the hard drive space on those little chips.
So what did they do?
They had to record a microscopic fraction of a second, maybe just the initial breath of the singers, and then electronically loop that tiny compressed snippet infinitely.
Wow.
That's why those keyboards sound so distinctively synthetic and plasticky.
They are heavily reliant on general MIDI sounds, the cheesiest, most artificial-sounding choir A's and synth strings you can possibly imagine.
It sounds like a haunted Super Nintendo game.
Yes, which triggers a completely different, much more nostalgic part of your brain.
And the musical theory they apply to these cheap sounds is just as strict. The tempos are agonizingly slow, usually dragging between 40 to 70 beats per minute.
And it's almost exclusively written in minor scales. But not just standard minor scales. The sources point out a heavy reliance on the Dorian and Phrygian modes.
Yeah. If you aren't super familiar with music theory, if you sit at a piano and just play the white keys starting from D and ending on the next D, you're playing in the Dorian mode.
Okay.
It lowers specific notes in the scale to create this feeling of unresolved ancient tension. It immediately strips away any modern pop sensibility and just drops you right into the Middle Ages.
No happy major chords allowed in the dungeon.
Definitely not.
They also avoid complex jazzy chords, right? Opting instead for simple whole-note melodies layered over power chords, which is essentially just stacking octaves.
It gives the music this very primitive, heavy, plodding feeling. And notably, there is almost no percussion.
None.
Almost none. If there is a drum, it's maybe just a deeply echoed timpani striking once every 8 bars way in the background.
Okay, so you have these primitive, slow melodies being played on inherently cheap, plasticky keyboards. But that is only half the battle, because the actual magic happens in the post-production.
Oh, the lo-fi processing.
Yes. This is the part I find absolutely brilliant. If you are listening to our deep dive right now on a pair of high-end, noise-canceling wireless AirPods.
Which a lot of people probably are.
Right. Well, the artists making Dungeon Synth are actively weaponizing their production to defeat the technology inside your ears. They want your AirPods to sound like a rotting boombox.
It is a meticulous process of intentional audio decay.
First, they use bit reduction. They take the audio file and crush the quality down to an 8 or 12-bit depth.
Which introduces this subtle digital crunch that perfectly mimics the hardware limitations of a 90s computer sound card.
Then comes the EQing, the equalization. They violently slash the extreme lows, anything under 100 hertz.
Right, and they chop off all the high frequencies above 6 or 8 kilohertz.
Just totally gut the spectrum.
Exactly. By removing those crisp, high-end details and the deep, modern bass, it immediately sounds like the music is playing through a single damp mono speaker.
After that, they run it through tape simulators. They inject fake steady cassette hiss across the entire track, and they introduce something called wow and flutter.
Oh, wow. And flutter is crucial. If you've ever listened to a physical cassette tape that has been left in a hot car, the magnetic tape literally physically stretches.
Right.
When it passes over the playback head, the pitch slightly bends and wobbles. It sounds kind of seasick and unstable.
And Dungeon Synth artists artificially program that wobble into their digital tracks to simulate physical degradation.
They do. And then there's the final ingredient, the absolute glue of the genre.
Massive reverb.
You take these dry, wobbling, bit-crushed synth sounds and you just drown them in huge holler plate reverb effects.
And we were talking about massive decay times, 4 to 8 full seconds of an echo just ringing out after a single key is pressed.
It is the audio equivalent of taking a cheap Casio keyboard, placing it at the very bottom of an enormous empty cavern, and hitting record from 100 feet away.
That is such a great visual. The whole process makes me think of putting a highly specific vintage filter over a photo. Like taking a pristine photo on a modern smartphone and then applying an app that adds fake scratches, light leaks, faded Polaroid colors, just to give it soul.
The Instagram filter analogy is close, but I'd argue there's a key psychological difference here.
What's that?
When people use an Instagram filter, they are usually trying to make their life look effortlessly cool or aesthetically pleasing to an audience, right?
They had to get likes.
In Dungeon Synth, the degradation isn't for an audience, it's defensive. They are actively trying to make the audio sound forgotten, isolated, and decayed to keep the modern world out.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. They are engineering a barrier. So we have this fiercely underground, tape-obsessed, highly misanthropic lo-fi culture that thrived in the 90s. But then the timeline shifts in a wildly unexpected way.
It really does.
Because after a lull in the early 2000s where the genre mostly faded into total obscurity, Dungeon Synth experienced an absolute explosion between roughly 2010 and 2023.
And here we arrive at the supreme irony of this entire movement.
Yeah.
A genre that was foundationally obsessed with ancient castles, analog cassette tapes, and extreme isolation was ultimately resurrected and saved by the modern internet.
It wasn't saved because someone stumbled upon an old demo tape buried in a Norwegian forest. It was saved by Reddit.
Precisely. Online communities finally codified the name Dungeon Synth. It gave all these disparate, isolated fans a single banner to rally under. But the real catalyst was the platform Bandcamp.
Oh, Bandcamp changed everything. It allowed anyone anywhere in the world to upload their strange lo-fi fantasy music and connect directly with listeners.
They completely bypassed the need for record labels, press agents, physical distribution.
It was basically the digital equivalent of that 90s mail-order tape trading,
Right.
but on a massive, instant global scale.
Right. And this internet renaissance triggered what is now recognized as the second and then the third wave of Dungeon Synth.
Because the barrier to entry was so low.
Just owning a laptop and a MIDI keyboard. So artists started rapidly pushing the boundaries of what the genre could actually be.
You saw incredible regional and stylistic variations emerge. Artists like Old Tower out of the Netherlands brought these incredibly majestic, deeply layered, almost terrifying compositions.
And then Thingwardrum in Portugal focused heavily on reviving that classic, raw, lo-fi 90s fantasy feel.
And then you had projects like Fife from the US, who introduced much brighter, folksy, acoustic-sounding melodies. Listening to Fife feels less like being trapped in a dungeon and more like resting in a lively medieval tavern.
This diversification meant the music could appeal to a much wider array of moods. It literally pushed the genre out of the tiny extreme metal underground and right into mainstream internet culture.
It's everywhere now. You can log on to YouTube right now and find multi-hour Dungeon Synth mix compilations with millions and millions of views.
Twitch streamers use it constantly.
Yeah, as background music for their broadcasts.
Yeah.
Because it's deeply atmospheric and instrumental, so it doesn't distract from their commentary.
And it has fractured into all these hyper-specific micro-genres. You have forest synth, winter synth, heroic synth.
We are even seeing a massive surge of creators jumping in from Asia.
Yeah, from Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, infusing their own local folklore and traditional instrumentation right into the lo-fi format.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. We've traced this from a few angry teenagers trading cassettes in Europe to literally millions of people streaming it globally while they code or study. Why?
It's a massive leap.
Why is a highly restrictive, deliberately low-quality genre born from the 90s metal underground resonating so powerfully with a global, chronically online audience today?
Well, if you look at the psychological function of the music, the massive leap in popularity actually makes perfect sense. I would argue that Dungeon Synth is exploding precisely because of our hyper-connected, relentlessly noisy modern world.
Because it's the exact opposite of what we experience every day.
Exactly. Think about our daily environment. We live in an era of infinite potential and absolute overstimulation.
Oh, completely.
We have AI that can generate a 4K photorealistic image of a castle in 3 seconds. We have lossless, perfect audio streaming. Everything is loud, immediate, and constantly demanding our attention.
It's exhausting.
And that infinite potential is actually paralyzing.
So the degradation becomes a safe haven.
Yes. Dungeon Synth offers a profound escape because it builds a wall against that endless noise. By deliberately choosing to sound like a rotting cassette tape from 1994, these artists are creating a safe, enclosed boundary.
Yeah.
It allows anyone to build their own solitary, quiet fantasy narrative without needing a massive corporate studio backing them. It's a quiet, atmospheric rebellion against modern perfection.
It's proof that you don't need high-end resources to make a lasting impact. By taking the moody, isolated spirit of extreme metal, mixing it with the imagination of tabletop RPGs, and applying a fiercely DIY attitude, these musicians have created a massive global culture of inner world building.
And that is the practical takeaway for you, the listener. Whether you are walking into a stressful corporate office, commuting on a crowded train, or just trying to carve out 5 minutes of peace in an overwhelming week, Dungeon Synth is a masterclass in engineered nostalgia as an antidote to modernity.
I love that.
It shows us the value of finding your own soundtrack to actively tune out the noise.
It really reframes the way we look at limitations. We spend so much time trying to upgrade our tools, get faster software, buy clearer headphones. But Dungeon Synth thrives entirely on restricting those options to spark genuine creativity.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. We live in an infinite digital world where we can instantly access anything. But if you intentionally limited the tools you use, like if you built your own artificial fences and embraced a little bit of imperfection, what kind of unique, protected inner world could you build for yourself?
It's a vital question. Sometimes creating boundaries in an endless world is the only way to find your focus.
So the next time you need to concentrate, maybe close a few browser tabs, put away the high-end tech, and just imagine yourself walking down that cold stone torchlit corridor. You might be surprised by what you find in the dark.